Good, again. Thank you very much, Steve. I very much enjoyed Bill's talk there. It took me back to my days in embryo transfer, and I agree entirely with the idea of animals balking as they're coming up the race. In Scotland we call that bogling, and there's nothing worse than a bogling beast. So you can take that one home with you. But today's talk's nothing to do with embryo transfer, or possibly could, but on this occasion it's going to be about Pestivirus in Eastern Australia. And I'm presenting this talk on behalf of myself and my co-authors, who are Marta Hernandez-Hover, who's a senior lecturer in epidemiology at the vet school, and also our chair, Steve Exton. So Pestivirus, some people consider it a multi-headed beast, and I was at a presentation a couple of weeks ago at the International Conference on Pediatrics, which is study of cattle diseases, and there were a couple of speakers there who were very enthralled with it because they figured that it was going to keep their research projects going for their careers. And certainly it's an intriguing virus, a very sneaky, intriguing virus. So what do we know about it? Bovine pestivirus. Well, we call it Pesti or Pestivirus here in Australia. The rest of the world tend to talk about BVDV, or bovine viral diarrhea virus. It occurs worldwide. It also includes in that same family classical swine fever and border disease. The clinical manifestations in cattle were first described in 1946 by Olafson and his co-workers in the USA. But it's been around for a lot longer than that, and it's now thought through some studies that the divergence of the virus into a porcine virus for classical swine fever, the border disease virus for sheep, and the BVDV for cattle happened probably as far back as about late 1400s, 1483 or thereabouts. There are two types. You might hear people talk about two types of pestivirus, type 1 and type 2. Type 2 predominantly occurs in North America, and again it's thought that the divergence into those two types happened as far back as about 1743. But in Australia we only have type 1. And there are a number of subgroups within that, but in Australia it's predominantly type 1C with some type 1A. The importance of that is when it comes to vaccine manufacturers, knowing the subtypes you're dealing with, so your vaccines are actually designed to tackle the correct virus type you have in the country or region. So what does it do? Let's just refresh our memories. A lot of you will know some of this already, or maybe all of it. If you have a naive, in other words, an animal that's never met the virus before, and it meets the virus for the first time as an animal walking around on the ground, it'll have a transient infection. It meets the virus, its immune system says, wait a minute, that's something we don't want in the body, let's produce antibodies against it, becomes immune, mops up the virus, everybody's happy, the animal goes on with its life. But if that naive animal is pregnant at the time it meets the virus for the first time, it itself may become immune to it, but the damage or the potential for damage to occur is with the fetus. And we know that that can then result in either poor fertility, if that's happening during the breeding period. It can occur as embryonic death or abortion. And also we get this development of what's known as the PI calf, or persistently infected calf. So if the virus enters that fetus, that unborn fetus, in the first third of pregnancy, the calf's immune system cannot produce any antibodies against it because it hasn't developed at that point. So the virus sneaks into the unborn fetus, hides there, and when the immune system of that fetus then starts to develop, it ticks off all the normal proteins in the makeup of the calf so that the body doesn't fight itself. And it ticks off the virus as being part of the normal makeup. So we'll never actually produce antibodies against it, we'll never protect against it, and that calf is then born as being a persistent shedder of the virus. If that introduction of virus happens later in pregnancy, then you can get fetal deformities, neonatal deaths, or weak calves. A feature that can occur for both those PI calves and those individuals that are transiently infected is immunosuppression. That means direct effect of the virus on the immune system of the animal, suppressing its ability to fight off other diseases, which means if other pathogens are around, such as those that might cause scours in calves, or respiratory disease in calves or older animals, such as in a feedlot situation, then you can have an opportunity for that disease to have a much greater effect because the direct effect on the immune system by the BVDV virus. And finally, we have these PI calves are normally infected with a strain. This last line here is something that can be detected under laboratory conditions, but we understand there are two biotypes of the virus, where there is non-cytopathic, which is the type that would create the PI calf. Once the PI calf is born, around about 6 to 24 months of age, in some of these animals that will mutate to a cytopathic strain. Cytopathic means it attacks the cells, and that's when we get this full-blown mucosal disease and rapid decline in the health of these animals and death with erosions. If you look in their mouths, you'll find there's ulcers and erosions in the mouth, ulcers and erosions in the feet, and actually those erosions in the mouth extend all the way through the gut right to the anus. So the poor animal has basically had its gut lining stripped off and it scours, and you get these diarrhea by which the disease gets its name. So having said all that, what's it doing in Australia? Well, it's reckoned that 80 to 90% of the herds have been exposed. About 30 to 40% of the cattle population have been exposed, and around about half to 1% of the population are PI animals, and that would be pretty much similar to other countries. You'll probably all know that a vaccine is available, known as Pestivirus through Zoetis, and that's been available since 2003. But prior to the vaccine launch, some people were achieving protection in their herds by deliberately exposing the naive herd mates to a PI animal. In 2006, a survey was conducted sponsored by the Meat and Livestock Australia, and there are a number of eminent authors of that, Sackett and Holmes from Wagga here, Professor Brutha Allworth, who's in the audience at the vet school, and also Kim Abbott, who was previously head of school here. The conclusion of this study was that the data on the prevalence of the BVD virus in Australia was incomplete. The impact of the disease could not be fully validated, and it was difficult to quantify the cost effectiveness of vaccination. So I came to Australia, jumped off the boat in 2012, and had a look around. Coming from Scotland, it's a country where we're actually going through an eradication process at the moment, and the third year of an eradication program for BVDV. And reading that survey, I was quite intrigued about the paucity of information, so figured it might be quite interesting to do a survey just to see where things were at the moment. So we sent out a mailing to 1,500 cattle producers, and some of you in the audience I know received those, and thank you for returning them. It was a double mail out. We had a desired sample size of 400, which would have accounted for a 25 to 30% response, and that would allow us a fairly good confidence interval around about 95%, assuming that any single practice was conducted by half of the respondents. So a commercial mailing database was used, and the proportion of mail-outs to each state were related to the number of people who existed on the database. So it ended up that 76 mailings went out to Queensland, 951 to New South Wales, and 473 to Victoria. What I'm going to present today are our initial findings from the first mailing. We have had more come in since then. And in the first round, we got 108 responses, and you can see the distribution of those there. About a quarter of those responding were in dairying, and the other 76% were in beef farming. The breeding cow herd size ranged between 50 to just under 2,000 cows, and the herd dynamics were described by the respondents as closed herds, so they didn't bring in any additional animals, 38%, having occasional introductions, half of the people, and regular introductions, 12%. When asked the question, which of the following list do you as the respondent identify as a possible consequence from a BVD infection in a susceptible animal, you can see that abortions and births of a PI calf and poor fertility are fairly well recognized. The suppression of immunity and also weak neonates is not so well recognized by, but is recognized by about 2/3 of the respondents, and about half of those that replied recognized calf deaths and deformities of the fetus could be a consequence of BVD infection. And then when asked which routes were possible to spread BVDV, and again a list was provided, the PI calf again is well recognized. That message has got out there that that is a source of infection and a source of virus. And also pretty well recognized was that saliva and nasal secretions are also a source. It appears that the transiently infected animal and aborted material were only acknowledged by about half of the people responding, and the influence of feces and semen were less so. Now that last box there with the semen is quite interesting because, again, at this conference that was up in Cairns a couple of weeks ago, there was some data presented about the impact of the virus in bulls. And in some bulls, and I must stress it's only some bulls, the virus can get into a bull, they mount an antibody response and become immune, but the virus can actually hide in the testes and continue to appear in the semen even though the animal itself has produced antibodies against it, and this happens for a period of time before that stops. And some testing recently has shown that even in New South Wales this year there are 5 bulls categorised in that category. And there's a very famous bull that was implicated in that called Cumulus, so you may hear of that. It's a New Zealand bull, that's when it was first identified. So the question was asked, how do you believe persistently infected animals arise? And as I explained earlier, you need to have infection of the fetus in the first third of pregnancy for this to occur. So again, most respondents recognised that fetal infection was important. There was erroneous acknowledgement that infection and creation of a PI could happen at the suckling calf stage or at the post-weaning infection, which is incorrect. When asked, would you seek advice on Pestivirus from your veterinary surgeon or veterinarian, 3/4 of people would seek advice through their vet for general advice, and about 2/3 on testing or vaccination. Interestingly, proportionally more advice was sought in New South Wales than Victoria. So about a third of the people who responded were actually conducting testing for antibodies. Now, antibodies are looking at historic exposure, because what we're looking at there is the response of the animal to previous infection. So it doesn't tell you if infection is there now, it tells you that the animal at some point in the past has been exposed. And a third of people are looking at that as a testing method. Another third use antigen testing, which is looking now for presence of virus or its part of the proteins that make up the virus in the animal currently, so looking at current infection. And about 13 respondents actually undertook both. And again, more testing is conducted in New South Wales than Victoria. You might be interested in this one, control of BVD. About a third of respondents are actually conducting any control program, 2/3 are not. And of those that are, vaccination is the predominant way of doing it, with 83% undertaking vaccination and the remainder undertaking deliberate exposure of naive herd mates to a persistently infected animal. This is in comparison to some of the data that was produced by Sackett and co-authors in that 2006 survey, which showed that vaccination wasn't really being utilised at that point. So it shows this, that shows that the uptake has been greater. Thank you. Unsurprisingly, most people were sourcing their vaccine through retailers, 10% through their local vet. And the median period by which people were conducting vaccination was around about 5 years. The range was from the start of this year to being doing it for 11 years, which is the duration that the vaccine has been on the market. It's important to, if you're going to do control, that the animals, the breeding animals, are fully immune and protected before the breeding season starts. So we want these animals to be fully, solidly immune at least 2 weeks before breeding. And the range of completion of the vaccination course varied between 1 week to more than 4 months, with the most common interval being that it was completed 4 to 6 weeks before breeding commenced. And 80% of people were ensuring that that was done by 2 weeks before breeding, which is a fairly good compliance rate in comparison to a similar study in the UK, which showed that only 50% of producers were achieving that there. Vaccination of bulls was undertaken by 2/3 of producers, and there are in view of my comments about the effect of the virus on bulls, that might be a low figure, or an undesirably low figure. To successfully complete vaccination, the primary course should consist of 2 injections with an interval of 4 to 8 weeks. The most common interval was 4 to 8 weeks, and the correct route of administration was utilised by everyone, and correct vaccine volume was given by nearly 90%. Interestingly, most producers reported that they vaccinate annually, but in subsequent questions in the questionnaire, only 56.7% have actually done so in the last 12 months. Again, not very surprising, but about 83% of people give some other treatment alongside the vaccine. You've got the animals in the crush, so let's make use of them. Everyone was chilling their vaccine on the day of use, which is good, and just about 85 to 86% of people were chilling the vaccine on the day of use using something simple like an ice brick in a cool box. For those that were using deliberate exposure in this early part of the survey, 6 farms were doing this, 4 in New South Wales and 2 in Victoria. 5 reported that they sourced the PI animal from their own herd, which did beg the question as if it was working so well, there shouldn't have been any PI animals in the herd, but there you go. The duration of exposure varied between 3 months to all year, with the most commonly reported duration being 6 months. And those animals, those PI animals, were being removed from the other animals between 2 weeks to a month before the breeding started, apart from the one farm who were running it all year round. So what's our conclusions? It would appear there are varying levels of understanding about BVDV and its spread. The impact on fertility and abortion is well understood, but the impact on the immune system is perhaps less so. Again, the role of the PI calf is well understood, but the potential involvement of semen and feces in the spread of the virus is less well acknowledged. When it comes to control, there are varying levels of engagement with this, with about 1/3 of people undertaking control measures. Use of vaccination is increasing, as I've discussed previously. There seems to be reasonably good compliance with the vaccine data sheet, but some high-risk behaviour still continues, with people not completing the vaccination course in sufficient time before they put the bulls in with the breeding females, or not ensuring that these time intervals are appropriate. And similar concerns could be said about the way that the deliberate exposure is being conducted. So you might say, well, that's all very well and interesting, but so what? Well, we understand better what producers are thinking and what producers are doing, but why are they doing it that way? What are the drivers that prevent better compliance? What can be done to improve that? Are those drivers appropriate, or is it necessary to change, or is everything that's being done okay? And we're hoping to progress this research in the future by, in particular, looking at the impact on productivity beyond fertility, and actually looking on how it affects the actual animal live weight gains and yields of carcass yields as well. Thank you very much.